As a columnist, I always ask, who cares? Why should anyone want to read what I'm writing? And I think I'm equally obliged as a speaker to inquire, why does it matter? Why are you here? What will I say that should affect your lives or the destiny of the country? It was Ralph Emerson who said that history is biography. What is politically doable is what we enable to happen, politically or otherwise. And at the founding of the United States Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, one of our framers at the convention, had emerged September 17, 1787, in the streets of Philadelphia, and he was encountered by an elderly lady who asked, "Doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarch?" And he retorted, "A republic, if we can keep it." And that's really what we're about here. Can we keep the republic? Because our institutions are not on cruise control. Each generation has to win the spirit and the letter of the Constitution over again. And if we don't insist on its enforcement, I can guarantee you it will be stolen from us. Those are just preliminary observations. With regard to the basic thesis that I'm presenting here, is we are confronting a dire peril to our existence as a republic. We are displaying all the trappings of empire. And I want to explain what it is that finds expression in our behavior, our foreign policy, and our institutions that are earmarks of empire. First and foremost, it's the idea that we should not have to assume any risk whatsoever, that we have an obligation to protect our country by going everywhere in the world and trying to destroy pre-embryonic threats to the nation. And therefore, we need to be in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal. We have, at present, bases in 135 foreign countries. Our defense budget is larger than the next 25 largest defense budgets in the world. And we are unique in only discerning in Afghanistan a dire threat to our existence. Our other NATO partners don't see it, even though we tell them that they ought to be frightened. We lecture the Pakistanis every day. You should be terrified. You're about to be overthrown by Al-Qaeda. And they don't get it. But I say that's one of these very critical elements of empire. All previous empires had this same proclivity to inflate fear, a millionfold in order to justify a military exertion. Great Britain was in Afghanistan. They were in Burma. They were in the First and Second Opium Wars. They were the Boer War. And they kept saying, oh, people will not respect us unless we fight and try to destroy them, if they try to insult us or suggest that they might not be comfortable with our institutions. And that's why in the United States, we have this very peculiar feature today in our existence. We are probably safer from foreign threats than any time in our entire history, if we take both non-government organizations and governments, given the weapon superiority we have, the budget superiority, the experience in fighting wars, the fact that there is no longer a superpower like the Soviet Union that threatens our sovereignty or whatsoever. And yet, despite the clear safety factor in our existence, we're fighting war. We have fighting wars everywhere around the world. The definition of the war against terrorism is that all of the world is a battlefield. We will fight and we claim the right to kill anybody, anywhere in the world, invade any sovereignty if we think that there's Al-Qaeda there. If we get it wrong, well, that's collateral damage. Could you imagine if other countries applied that theory to the United States? If the Russians thought that there was a Chechen sympathizer with one of the terrorist groups there, they could launch a missile attack in the United States to try to kill them. We would think that's outrageous. We would probably declare war. Yet, in the obverse way, we go into Pakistan, we go into Yemen, we go into any country in the world and say, if we think there's a terrorist there, we can invade you. Your sovereignty means nothing. Again, this comes from this craving. We are an empire. Don't present a risk to us. We shouldn't have to incur any kind of disturbance to our tranquility. And it's a phenomenon that's not unique to governments. Individuals act that way as well. You give them absolute power, they will tyrannize and try to destroy anything that threatens their particular security. Now, what else finds expression in empire is the attitude, I think largely of the people, that we need the government to have the power launched in the executive branch to make us safe. And therefore, the United States has basically yielded all of the separation of powers that's kept us free for hundreds of years. The president decides virtually everything of significance in the United States unilaterally. One of the examples that shows you how peculiar the situation is concerns a status of forces agreement that the United States negotiated with Iraq. It took effect at the beginning of this year. And it dealt with some of the immunities that the United States forces and contractors had from crimes committed in Iraq. Well, this status of forces agreement in Iraq was submitted to the Parliament, it was debated as amended, and it'll be subject to a referendum in July of this year. In the United States, however, President Bush did this. It was a solo performance. Congress had no input. The people had no input. It was just done unilaterally. Said, is this a little bit odd? I mean, we're taking lessons from democracy from Baghdad. Now, we know that Bush wanted to export democracy, but we didn't think that made it taking it away from the United States. But that apparently is what had happened as regards to this status of forces agreement. But that's just one example. With regard to all the other major decisions, war and peace, executive branch detentions without accusation or charge, military commissions, interrogations in foreign lands and secret prisons without any kind of controls. Congress exercises no oversight whatsoever. It is true that on occasion the executive branch has gone to Congress and obtained authorization for enemy combatants through the Military Commissions Act of 2006. But these were pro forma hearings. I actually testified one concerning the suspension of habeas corpus in the Military Commissions Act. By the way, a provision that the United States Supreme Court held was unconstitutional in 2008. And the hearing lasted about 2 hours. This was, one of the rare times in the history of the United States that habeas corpus was suspended. And he had a few questions. Oh, well, hey, they're all guilty, Mr. Fein. Why are we giving them any rights? I said, well, Senator, sometimes we get it wrong. Tokyo Rose was pardoned, and oftentimes we make mistakes. And the people at Guantanamo Bay, those who had habeas corpus, 90% of them have been freed, even though they haven't been charged with a crime. That's the nature of the beast. And that's why we distinguish ourselves from uncivilized countries, that we care about only punishing the guilty people. Oh, but habeas corpus was suspended instantly, overwhelmingly approved both by the Democrats and the Republicans in the House and the Senate. So to the extent that Congress has even made cameo appearances in the national security structure, it has been largely just ratify whatever the president says. We go to another example with regard to the Iraq War. The Iraqi war resolution was a provision that the Democrats crafted, largely the architect of was Joe Biden, who now sits in the vice president's office. And it provided that basically we are too ignorant to know whether to go to war with Iraq. And although the Constitution saddles us with the responsibility of war and peace, we'll let the president to decide. Mr. Bush, you decide whether we need to go into Iraq. You decide whether weapons of mass destruction. We don't want to exercise that responsibility as the elected people's voice. Now, it's a little bit odd that they would do that, because in the Constitutional Convention and ratification period, it was uniformly said, we must fasten the responsibility for entering war on elected representatives, because we don't want to be hurried into war. We don't want one person ever to have the authority to engage in war, because especially if it's the executive, he will get us into needless wars, because what does war do to the executive? He gets the power, he gets the fame, he gets the patriotism, he gets the money, he gets the military contracts. So the Founding Fathers said they will concoct reasons to get us into war. Only Congress has that authority. That's their greatest safety. Now, unfortunately, the members of Congress don't read anymore, at least not after next day's newspaper. And so they wouldn't have a ghost of an idea about what the Founding Fathers were saying. And so they would nonchalantly say, this is fine. We don't want to decide the war. Dianne Feinstein, a senator from California, said, well, this can be Bush's war. If it goes wrong, it won't be us. We can put the blame on the president. We don't want to have that responsibility. And moreover, if we go to war and it turns out bad, we might lose the next election. And that would be terrible. Very, very terrible. Because after all, their mission in life is to have fame and remembrance and jump on TV and bark like a peacock from time to time. And this is, it's unfortunate that you think I'm exaggerating, but I'm actually I'm understating the psychology of effeteness and droopiness in the members of Congress. They don't want to exercise any responsibility. The president, hey, we're the superpower, he has to decide all these issues. And so when you get situations where there needs to be oversight, as was done to finally bring to conclusion the Vietnam War. It doesn't exist. William Fulbright in the 1960s began a series of hearings on what was the light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam, which never appeared. And it was through that kind of probing, which occurred in part because there was a draft. So people like you had to go over there and fight, and it wasn't just all volunteer army where the lower class people did all the dying. Those were the hearings that actually challenged these assumptions. What about Iraq and Afghanistan? There's nothing. Let's just think about what an oversight hearing about our presence in Afghanistan would be. Number one, well, Mr. President, you're saying we're fighting for liberty because they would suffer so terribly without the United States tutelage over there. Then somebody might say, well, Mr. President or Ms. Secretary of State, the Afghan parliament recently passed a law that the President Karzai signed that said any woman in the state of marriage has to submit to any sexual overture of a husband. She can't go outside unless the husband says she can do that. We're fighting for that? That's liberty and freedom? Now, there might be a second question. Why is it that the only way we can prevent another 9/11 is to have our troops thousands of miles away searching in caves? Why can't we have them around the United States? And being alert, we don't want to be reckless. The same way we try to protect ourselves against another Timothy McVeigh. There's certainly a chance we could have a Timothy McVeigh crash into some kind of building and kill hundreds. But we don't have the military going out there and out policing the streets. Why is it? Why is it only the United States, of all the NATO members, that feels that Afghanistan is a clear and present danger to the safety of all of the world? Why only the United States? Remember, Obama wanted to go to Germany, France, Great Britain, give us more troops. And he preached, like his predecessor, Bush, this is the greatest menace to the history of civilization in the 21st century. These Al-Qaedas. It is worse than the Red Army, worse than the Luftwaffe, worse than Hirohito, worse than all of these people combined. This one man who can get up in a video with his beard and say, we're going to kill you, and then, okay, if he says it, then we must go on alert. Suspend habeas corpus, enemy combatants. My gosh, this must be the apocalypse is about ready to hit us. And the reason why these things are said is precisely this attitude of empire. Hey, no one should be able to insult us. We're the United States of America. Why is it you would ask at an oversight hearing, how come these NATO countries don't feel this way? Spain has been attacked. Great Britain has been attacked. Indonesia. We tell Pakistan, oh, Al-Qaeda is about ready to overthrow you. You should be terrified. But they sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, maybe we know what our vulnerabilities are better than you. So that's what real oversight would be. What is the game plan in Afghanistan? What is the exit strategy? No, Obama has said, all right, now we're not going to build democracy. We're just, in lieu of that, we're not going to do the nation building. We're just going to have a government that's strong enough to prevent Al-Qaeda and Taliban from ever obtaining power again. Well, doesn't that mean you've got to build a country that has legitimacy, that's not corrupt, that's not inefficient, that actually respects liberty? Well, doesn't that mean you're going to be there for the next 50 or 60 years or 100 years? Because in Afghanistan, you're at what I call the pre-Magna Carta stage of political maturity. Magna Carta was 1215 in Great Britain, the first time they tried to incorporate some semblance of law and restraints on the executive branch. You aren't even at Magna Carta stage in Afghanistan. But Congress, because it's, again, imbued with this idea, empire, the president has to decide everything, there are no serious oversight hearing whatsoever. Whatever the president says goes. There's no questioning of what these theories are. How are you going to make the Afghan government not corrupt? It's like the insinuation is that the previous administration had a plan. Let's make the Afghan government corrupt. We want them to take bribes, which is absurd on its face. There's no legitimacy to the government there. That's why people take bribes. There's no sense of an Afghan unity. You've had tribalism there for 4,000 years. So what else is new? The greatness of the Founding Fathers was they knew what they didn't know. They didn't try to overreach. They understood, as John Quincy Adams put it, July 4th address, 1821, we don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, which is what empires do. That the influence of the United States abroad would be by force of example. We'd wish freedom everywhere, but we're not going to have the United States force its citizens to go die for someone's liberty in Georgia or Ukraine or China or elsewhere. Because the Constitution itself says Opening preamble. The purpose of this enterprise is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, period. People want to volunteer to go fight abroad, that's up to them. But the United States government and the United States enterprise is limited under our Constitution to protecting this country, preserving its freedoms, preserving its liberties, and making sure that in the source of trying to go abroad and create a perfect world, we don't destroy our own republic in the process, which is where we are at present. We have destroyed our own republic. Just think of how little we know of what the government's doing today. The idea of self-government, which is the heart and soul of why the United States was different, is that the people need to know what their government is doing and why in order to make a political judgment. You approve or disapprove. That's what the opening words of the Constitution mean. We, the people of the United States, ordain and establish the Constitution. It's not the king giving power down. It's that the government has no authority that we don't give them. And you need to know what your rulers are doing to know whether you approve or disapprove. All the secrecy out there, the Congress makes no inquiry. All the alleged fears out there. Dick Cheney tells us and Obama, oh, all of this surveillance program, all these enemy combatants, they have enabled us to thwart scores of terrorist plots, but they won't tell us what. Why should we believe you? The government's pretty good at leaking out anything they want to leak. And if you had all these success stories, why wouldn't you be leaking them out? So we don't know what our government is doing. All these classified information, state secrets, we still don't know 7 years after the fact. All of us who may have been spied on by the government illegally under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act without warrants, who was spied on? Why did you select them to spy? What's done for the information? Are they getting credit anymore? Are they on the watch list? We don't know. Now, I'll just take a brief diversion into a personal anecdote about my testimony last week, Wednesday. It was before the House Committee on Homeland Security. It was the chairperson is Jane Harman. Now, Jane is someone who you may recall was told earlier on by Bush and Cheney with Nancy Pelosi about the illegal surveillances and torture memos and said nothing because she knew they must have been telling the truth. After all, they come from the executive branch. But Jane was someone who was a great enthusiast for what they call a fusion centers. Now, this is not fusion like in nuclear fusion where you're trying to create power, or fusion that you may use to explode a hydrogen bomb. The fusion centers, it's an odd name, was designed to enlist 800,000 state and local law enforcement officers to spy and gather intelligence on everything that might be an earmark of a future terrorist attack. 800,000. And they were going to do this without violating anyone's privacy or First Amendment rights. And we've had fusion centers around now for many years. They haven't actually shown to have ever stopped anything. And you can imagine, given the complexity of identifying a terrorist, well, what do you look at to see whether someone's a terrorist? Is it what they're saying on the sidewalk? Is it whether they're attending a mosque or a synagogue or a church? And remember, the state, I don't want to be disparaging, the typical state and local law enforcement officer does not have a real high cerebral capacity. No, we need to be worried about it. For example, in Maryland, where they had the state troopers, they thought the future terrorists were those who were protesting the death penalty. They got on the list real fast, and they were listed as terrorists. Now, fortunately, they don't have grades, so you don't get A, B, C, D, E, F, because otherwise they probably would flunk if you had an outside grade. But that's the mindset. Now, my testimony related to what we do know the intelligence reports gathered by these foot soldiers in the war against terrorism. Now, I've got 800,000 state and local officers really make us feel secure. They're so good at making sure there aren't any terrorist cells here. Now, put aside the fact that the FBI has searched for 7 years and they've come up with a number of al-Qaeda terrorist cells in the United States. It's 0. 0. But, hey, this is an empire. We can't take a risk. At the pre-embryonic stage, we need abortions. Now, it sounds oxymoronic. How can you do an abortion at the pre-embryonic stage? But, hey, this is terrorism, so don't ask questions. Now, then this particular report out of the fusion centers, wow, they're really frightened of these groups that Islamic radicalism is taking hold. Now, what's the proof? Well, the U.S. Department of Treasury, over on Pennsylvania Avenue, they held a course called Islamic Banking 101. And somebody in Houston got an Islamic banking loan for their home. That was frightening. And then they said, moreover, they're exploiting the democracy in very insidious ways. For example, they're using hip-hop music to promote their ideas. They're using chat sessions and blogs on the internet. That's really dangerous stuff. And then they're finding their ideas into the political process. For example, they think that maybe you should have school holidays that are adjusted to Islamic calendar like Christian calendar. That's really dangerous. Really, really dangerous. I mean, after all, tolerance has its limits in the United States. And so and this goes out everywhere. These are the people who are protecting our liberties. Now, you might be reassured that Congress was holding this oversight hearing to prevent the fusion centers from getting out of control, like's happened to every previous effort to run spy programs, COINTELPRO. That was the effort to spy on Martin Luther King and all the anti-war movement in the 1960s. And then it has previous iterations, McCarthyism, whatever. Jane Harmon's there, and she's the chairperson, so she has those who are running the fusion centers there at the first panel. She says, and I had written an article that was published the same morning, questioning their fidelity to the First Amendment. How would they know what the First Amendment meant? They'd never received lessons or otherwise. So she asked each of these leaders of the fusion centers, do you respect the First Amendment? Mr. Fein says no. He says, of course we do. Okay. Do you do civil liberties training? Yes. Okay. Now, do you really get a lot of good intelligence? Yes. Okay. That's the end of the questioning. There's nothing further. That's oversight. I said, yeah, that's Dick Cheney told us he all respected our constitutional rights too. And that was the end of the question. This is oversight? This is oversight. Now, they did point out that after this particular intelligence report from the Fusion Center was distributed, they rushed down from Washington, had some from the Department of Homeland Security, giving them a lecture. Hey, you shouldn't do this. They didn't point out that, but no one was demoted, no one was reprimanded, no one lost a dollar, or what it was that you found wrong in the Fusion Center report that seemed to suggest that we're at war with democracy. No. If free speech is convincing people, it must be bad. And you can imagine that at the state and local center, they view anything unorthodox as suspicious. Because one of the definitions of terrorism we have in our U.S. Code is attempting to change government policy by intimidation or coercion, like marching, like protesting, sitting in the back of the bus. You know, you really want to change the policy. Oh, gosh, we don't want to do that. Or like Susan B. Anthony voting and getting arrested because she was a woman and couldn't go into the ballot box. Oh, you might be a terrorist then, because you want to change government policy. Now, if we think of our own history and imagine the British having a fusion center, who would the first people be arrested? Boston Tea Party, you're out, man. No way. No way. Your committees of secret correspondence, you're gone. Protest against the stamp tax, you're out. No, you're revolutionaries. We can't tolerate this stuff. And that is the mindset of, the empire. We've come to the perfect world. We don't want anything to be challenged. Anything that challenges authority is suspect because you might be a future terrorist, and therefore we want to spy on you and collect information, and what happens to it we don't know about. These state and local fusion centers are useful to the government in the sense that because it's not the federal government, there's no Freedom of Information Act, there's no transparency other than what leaks out into the press. Now, what I asked, someone on the committee panel asked, well, Mr. Fein, have you actually seen these fusion centers? And I said, well, no, but of course I didn't have to go to Guantanamo Bay to know that we were detaining lots of people there, given our process there, who were innocent, like the Uyghurs. I don't know, Uyghurs probably sounds very foreign to you. There are 17 inhabitants of northeast China who were protesting their oppression there, and we picked them up, and they were rotted 7 years in Gitmo. The government has now finally conceded that, no, they're not enemy combatants. They don't threaten the United States. They shouldn't have been picked up. But government says, you're illegal aliens. We can't release you. You came here without a visa. You didn't get a green card before we captured you and kidnapped you to take you here. And therefore, you got to stay down in Guantanamo Bay. Now, Obama comes and says, okay, I'm new on the beat. We're going to change things from the Bush reign. So I'm going to keep them there, but I'm going to tell them they're not enemy combatants anymore. So you can imagine the rejoicing. Oh, God, this is great. At least we're not enemy combatants. We're still in cages. We can't have freedom, but we're not enemy combatants. We're so happy. This is a new era. New era. You know, we've just moved so far away from the old era. Now, and they should understand the privilege, because Obama has continued to call people at Bagram prison in Afghanistan enemy combatants. So the Gitmo people ought to be real privileged, because others still suffer that opprobrium of enemy combatant status. Now, what needs to be done, and this is the theory of my book, if we're going to restore what the Founding Fathers envisioned as a republic, we need to renounce all of this global military profile. We need to make defense defense. This idea that the best defense is a good nonsense, it may sound like a good slogan. It is absurd on its face. No, the best defense is defense. You don't run preemptive wars everywhere. Abraham Lincoln once put it when he was opposing the Mexican-American War, which was conjuring up this fear that the British or the French would have a monarchy in Mexico City if we didn't invade Mexico. He said, well, what will happen if you authorize preemptive wars is tomorrow. The president will say, oh, Great Britain is going to invade Canada and use that as the beachhead in the United States. And I'll say, well, there's no evidence of that. That's concoction. They'll say, well, that's tough for you. I see it. If you don't, that's too bad. And that's, of course, what happens when you change defense into offense. Then you can go anywhere, because anything is a conceivable threat. You can't live life having a zero-risk existence. And the Founding Fathers would prefer freedom than zero-risk existence. So we need to come back to true defense. Get out of NATO. You know, NATO, by the way, Article 5, most of you would be stunned to know that we are now by treaty obliged to protect the likes of Croatia or Albania if they're attacked. Why are we? We are. And we're urging, you know, Ukraine to come in. So if they have a dispute with Russia over Sevastopol, then we go fight for Ukrainians. What in the Constitution entitles the U.S. government to tell you ought to go die so a Ukrainian can be free from Russian oppression or whatever, assuming that would be true? You can volunteer. But where's that? Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's what this country is about. This nonsense that we have is kind of a global obligation to go everywhere in defense of freedom, assuming that is freedom, like Afghanistan, is counter-constitutional. It's not what the Founding Fathers wanted. I go back. What they said, we don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. When we acquired our independence, do you think we attacked the French Bourbon monarchy or the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire? We didn't even go to the aid of the South American colonies throwing off the yoke of Spain. We said, no, we encourage your freedom. We don't send our people abroad to die for your freedom. So defense means eliminating all of our treaties. We need to get out of the UN. We need to take all those defense resources and redeploy them in the United States. It means we can still have aircraft carriers, we can have spy planes, but everybody in defense is here for one reason: defend the United States from attack. And I would wager no country would attack us. We wouldn't be building up resentments abroad that come from occupying their land, from bombing wedding parties, because when you're going after al-Qaeda, there's intermixture of blending into civilian populations. The great resentments that build up because we have such double standards. You know, in the war on terrorism, it's legal for us to kill them. If they kill us, it's murder. Could you imagine a legal regime that says, oh, one party can try to kill the other, that's legal, but if they try to fight back, it's a crime? And of course, people think, hey, that's not fair. You don't have to be a genius to understand, you know, the wild irrationality of this is a legal regime that we impose on the rest of the world. So we come back and we have solely defense. We insist that only the Congress can take us into war. Only the Congress. And we need to vote out every member of Congress who wants to yield all the power to the executive. Said, we don't elect you there to be wallpaper. You decide things. We need to eliminate any presidential authority of privilege to keep information secret. If it has to be confidential to Congress, he can do it in covert sessions if you have particular manufacturing designs for a nuclear weapon or something like that. But the president should not be able to withhold anything from Congress whatsoever. Nothing. By the way, even George Tenet, former director of the CIA, acknowledged that leaks come far more out of the executive branch than out of the Congress. The executive branch is far more indiscriminate in leaking out classified information than the Congress is. And then we need to get back, we need to eliminate this concentration of power in the executive. We need to eliminate that concentration of power in the executive. None of this delegation of, and both domestically and in foreign affairs. The Congress should be deciding, well, if there's to be a bailout, where the money goes. It isn't here, Mr. President, you just spend $1 trillion where you think it'll do good. It's the equivalent of the Congress enacting a law that says, President, write a fair internal revenue code. No. The most important thing that needs to come in this culture is not the legal rules. Because the destiny of any country is driven more by the unwritten cultural expectations than by what you can put in a legal code. And where the United States has succumbed, I think, to this attitude of empire is also the citizenry believing that they no longer get a thrill and insist on self-government, that they're not vassals. If there are mistakes, they will make them as educated citizens voting directly and indirectly for their representatives. That this idea that we will accept any advice, any dictate from above is intolerable. That's what happens in kingships. Not in the United States. It's we make those decisions. If we get them wrong, we accept responsibility. And that's what makes us different. That's what made the country thrive. The people said, no, we aren't going to be subordinate to platonic guardians. If we make an error, we'll learn from our mistakes. The same way you raise kids. You don't keep them sheltered forever. And that's what gives you dignity. This is the United States of America. This is not Russia. This is not China. We do not want other people to make decisions for us. We have to struggle with these moral questions, these difficult issues ourselves. That's what makes us strong as a people. Before I open up questions, I just want to read you an observation that Alex de Tocqueville made in 1835 about what he then perceived as the difference between the United States and Russia, which he perceived as being the future dominant forces on the world stage. And how, at the end of this, you'll see how much that distinction that he made then is now diminished or non-existent. And what he wrote as a poet when he was describing what he thought would be the future landscape of world power, he wrote, and thus the conquests of the American are made with the plowshare of the laborer, those of the Russian with the sword of the soldier. Now think who's using the sword of the soldier to make conquest today. To attain his goal, the first, the United States, relies on personal interest and allows the force and reason of individuals to act without directing him. The second, Russia, in a way, concentrates all the power of society in one man. Now, the one has, this is the United States, has freedom for his principal means of action, the other, servitude. Now, it's quite unfortunate that that description, that distinction made by de Tocqueville is largely vanished today. We concentrate power in one man. Servitude, that's what Afghans have, right? We bomb your parties. We don't even count all the deaths that we inflict in Iraq or Afghanistan. We count our own, but theirs don't count for anything. And moreover, how are we trying to exercise our influence? It's not by force of example, because if it was our example, we'd have countries, what, doing torture, flouting the rule of law, having no judicial review of detentions or otherwise. It's by the sword. We're stronger than you. We're tougher than you. The reason why you don't kidnap our people and we kidnap yours is because we will destroy you with weapons. And that, in my judgment, is the true tragedy that the United States encounters today. Now, of course, we're living through it, so many times we don't perceive it to be an empire, since you're accustomed to just accept things the way they are. But ladies and gentlemen, the Founding Fathers would not recognize this country today. They would be aghast that they had fought so much for individual liberty, for representative, accountable government, for checks and balances, to see now something that looks like Russia then, the Russian Tsar. And if this is to be changed, it's you that have to change it. We have to get it built into every conversation at schools, in classrooms, in dinner tables, say, no, we do not want this. We don't want to be the superpower, because our obligation is to ourselves and our posterity. To the extent we're a superpower, it's by example alone, period. And then we will be truly proud to be Americans and be different from every other empire. Thank you, and I'll accept questions now.
The microphone that we have here is only for the camera, so if you please speak up when you ask your question so everybody can hear.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I don't know if this is on. I assume it is. For your fine views. And let's say your scenario is correct, that we take back all the military installations around the world, pull them all back to the United States. And we have that scenario exactly as you would like to see. Now let's transpose that back to 1935 and look at America when it was very, very reluctant to get into a war, which was sprouting up in Europe. So how would you account for that?
I would account for it the same way the Founding Fathers would have. Until the attack is on the United States of America, there is no justification for our initiating war against anyone else. Now, obviously, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, then we were in war. We were attacked, and I don't object to fighting someone who attacks you. But despite all this, well, people say, if we would have intervened earlier, we started the war, maybe came to Great Britain's aid, somehow that would have prevented World War II. There's no substantiation for that whatsoever. And the fact is, does it mean that you accept some risk? Of course. That's what life is about, accepting some risks. And if you want to have at least a comparison today about people saying we have to go everywhere about al-Qaeda, because fortunately we don't even confront anything close to the menace of what you've described in 35, given our superpower status. Most of you would be astonished if I told you since 9/11, there have been approximately 150,000 murders in the United States. A 61% clearance rate, that means an arrest was made, and 39% there's not even an arrest. 150,000 murders. Now, could you imagine what the country would look like if you had 150,000 people killed by terrorists? I mean, this would be a military, we'd have martial law. Why is it the risk that any of us encounters today from being murdered is vastly higher than ever being victim of a terrorist incident? In fact, I would wager, I don't know whether you would remember the period where the Washington area snipers, I think it was early 2001 or 2. I was a lot more frightened at that time than I am today. It's not because I think al-Qaeda isn't evil. There are evil people all over the place. There are Eric Rudolphs, there are Timothy McVeighs, there are al-Qaeda and otherwise. But this idea that we need this projection abroad in order to be safe, it seems to me absolutely absurd. Now, people say, well, these people just don't like freedom. Now, I've been around 41 years, and just in Washington, I'm older than 41, I can guarantee you that. It's probably to my detriment, all what I've observed. But it isn't in human nature to get angry at something thousands of miles away. If the anger and the enemies we are creating by keeping our military forces abroad multiplies the danger a millionfold worse than the fact that we don't have soldiers looking at caves in Afghanistan or dropping bombs that hit wedding parties or whatever. I reiterate, there is nothing today that could threaten the sovereignty of the United States, as unlike World War II, that would justify our initiating warfare anywhere. Now, of course, I recognize, history is imponderable. Maybe at some future time, something that I can't foresee would interject itself into the equation, and you'd have to adjust this. And being someone who's observed history for 4,000 years, something like that could come up. But then you adjust at that time. I'm talking about for the indefinite future, what we can see and what we know right now. And it's absurd to think right now that we need to fear anything like even 1935. So let's act with regard to reality now. We should never submit to formulas about government policy and human affairs. You always have to incorporate new knowledge and circumstance. Any policy in all circumstances at some points become unwise. So what I'm addressing is what is existent today and what I think would probably be a good policy for 100 years, but maybe things would change if there was one country that dominated the entire world other than the United States, and maybe there would be some menace that I can't possibly foresee. But right now, the critical dimension is we are empire, get these troops back here.
Well, I will take program director's prerogative here, and I was very intrigued by your article on the fusion centers that you had in the Washington Times, and could you please expound upon these fusion centers and kind of give us your assessment on their threat to our liberty, if you think they are, and how much of a threat they might be?
Well, remember that the fusion centers are part of this cluster of response to 9/11, which, again, magnified the fear of international terrorism a millionfold and said, oh, we got to do something. It's of the same genre that gave us the military commissions and gave us the enemy combatants and gave us the illegal terrorist surveillance program and all the other horrors, the torture and whatever. And so the idea after 9/11, even though the 9/11 Commission found that no matter what had happened before, it wasn't an absence of intelligence sharing that caused 9/11 to occur. It was flukish in some respects, but it wasn't because we weren't collecting intelligence. And moreover, how are you going to collect the intelligence? This idea that there's some kind of paradigm of a terrorist is ridiculous. People say, oh, these people, they grow up in impoverished, unfree circumstances. Well, Osama bin Laden was as rich and privileged a kid as you can imagine. You know, he was born into a huge, wealthy estate, and at least half the so-called 9/11, the 19 on the planes, they were educated. They didn't suffer, they weren't suffering privation at all. The other half were there probably because they got paid. But this idea of fusion centers, okay, now we're going to recruit 800,000 state and local law enforcement officers to spy on everybody and everything without telling us. And they'll focus on non-criminal intelligence and seek to create profiles. This is what a terrorist looks like. And they will then share this information, have the ability to move it back and forth everywhere. So a policeman, this is what Jane Harmon, the chairman of the committee, said at that hearing, it'll be a policeman on the beat who will then stop that next Osama bin Laden from rearing his head. And it's, in my mind, utterly lunatic. You just get reams of information, so they don't know what to do with it all, because there isn't any way in which you sort out, oh, this is a person who's likely to be terrorist, this or not. And because terrorism is described in substantial part with wanting to change government policy, you then start spying on people who want to change government policy, whether it's the death penalty, whether it's the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, it could be same-sex marriage. And you're dealing with these foot soldiers who are like the immigration officials as well. I worked in the Department of Justice for 15 years, so I know what the level of intelligence is, and it's not what you'd want to entrust anybody with a sense of a decision to make. So they just go gather everything. I mean, the absurdity of suggesting, oh, you spoke at Ron Paul's Liberty Convention. Oh, you're libertarian. People here. Okay, that's an earmark of terrorism. No. Because there's a correlation. People who don't like the government don't like Ron Paul. No, maybe they think the government's policies are wrong because they are wrong. You know, that's what freedom means. And so we have these unknown thousands of people gathering intelligence on us, information, we don't even know where it goes or what's done with it. No, what we do know is that it's solved not a single crime whatsoever, and it's squandering just countless resources. You know, with a murder clearance rate of 61, that ought to be 90, you know, or 95. And yet, oh, since it's 9/11 and you get the money, the federal government gives the money, then you get this, you develop these spy programs, and hey, then you have nice employment. And of course, what do if you're out there gathering intelligence? You got to find something. Otherwise, you'll be unemployed. Hey, you didn't give an intelligence report today. One of the oddities, I mean, sort of hilarious in a very obtuse way, of this North Texas Fusion Center was the intelligence reports that I was described about how Islamic radical fundamentalism is gaining ground politically in the United States. It was placed adjacent to another, this terrorism intelligence report, with another report on how the cattle in North Texas have to be protected in the event of another natural disaster and drought, how you can respond very quickly to that. You read them, this is part of the same, these are the intelligence collection people. It shows, you know, how discriminating minds they have. You know, searching for Islamic radicalism and protecting the cattle in a natural disaster to agriculture out there. And so what's the danger is we have a society that starts to look like the Stasi in East Germany. They're just collecting information without any discrimination, not telling us where it is. There's no Right to Privacy Act where we know what's being collected on us. We don't know where the information ends up. Is it at a bank? Is it an enemy? Is it an employer's office or otherwise? Do we end up on a watch list? Again, part of the greatest danger of the freedom is we don't know what the government's doing anymore. But we surely can anticipate that is collecting information on our First Amendment activities, because that's the first thing that makes them suspicious. Oh, you're against the government, then you must be a Timothy McVeigh, or not that, Osama bin Laden. And I would, lobby Congress, shut these damn things down. Get them to focus on crime. With murder rates what they are, having all those resources trying to prosecute those who are guilty of murder and take away this idea of spying on Americans and making dissent the equivalent of disloyalty or treason.
I wonder if you have an opinion on the relationship of like the drug war and the massive growth of domestic police forces and as well as I guess some international activities on the front of fighting against illegal drugs, and how that maybe has allowed some of the surveillance kind of activities and the other kind of spying on citizens to be able to occur, because it's kind of already so big, we're already doing so much that is maybe it isn't as noticeable that we're kind of extending into these new areas with the war on terrorism.
Well, I think that's a very astute observation. It was James Madison who said it's right to be alarmed at the first encroachment on our freedom. And if you look at the drug war, and I was in government at the time that emerged in the early 1970s, it's a precursor to where we are today. Because it was, first of all, the use of language, metaphor, a war. It then indicates, well, then we should have all the implements or powers of war in order to fight the drug cartels. Secondly, it was the drug war that initiated the use of the military for law enforcement purposes. Then they were to interdict. The military would, those who are trying to smuggle drugs in abroad. So here we have some breakdown in what we call the Posse Comitatus Act that generally makes it illegal for the military to be involved in domestic law enforcement. And then we have, because it's drugs and it's largely what they call victimless crime in the sense that you have willing buyers and willing sellers, then requires all the surveillance that you've described. In fact, the initial efforts to use electronic surveillance and wiretapping emerged during the Prohibition era to try to get bootleggers because they couldn't get the evidence otherwise. And that was one of the very great first disasters of the United States Supreme Court. In 1928, a case called United States versus Olmstead, where the court held that there were no Fourth Amendment protections for conversations because the words of the Fourth Amendment speak of protecting persons, houses, papers, and effects. And then Chief Justice William Howard Taft said, I don't see conversations in there, so I guess it doesn't apply. It would be like reading the authority in Article 1 to create a Navy and armed forces to exclude Air Force because, hey, it's not Air Force there. You can't just fly planes. Where is it? And that's real genius there legally. And it took 40 years before the Supreme Court finally reversed that decision in a case called Katz versus the United States. But this is exactly that kind of effort to go after transactions in a very aggressive way that don't threaten society, that certainly paved the way to use surveillance otherwise. Now, I don't want to say that terrorism is like drugs. In some sense, the surveillance in the terrorism area is more dangerous because whatever you can say about the mindlessness of the drug war, you're not focusing on political activity. Those who are smuggling drugs aren't challenging government policy or whatever. They want to make money. But with regard to the terrorism, it's so blended with politics. That's where you get the real danger. They'll start equating legitimate democratic activity with crime, which is the death knell of a republic. You can't have that. The citizens need to be encouraged. There's too little democratic activity, not too much. And when you create this aura out there that, hey, if you go out there and you protest, you demonstrate, you'll be in a spy file that the fusion centers will compile, ordinary human nature for many will say, all right, I don't want to get bothered. I have a hard enough time. I don't want to be hassled at the airport. I better just not say or do anything, which is, say, a real injury to the vitality of the democratic polity.
Follow along the same lines with the last two questions. I was going to ask about what you think about the future of the Patriot Act, since it seems that Washington has kind of become reliant on it and various intelligence gathering agencies have become dependent upon it. Do you think that when it comes up, when various aspects come up for re-ratification, that Congress or, as you explained, the executive branch will continue?
Number one, I think the Patriot Act is a symbol of the national security state that was erected post 9/11, because its particular provisions are far less menacing than the Military Commissions Act of 2006, which was truly horrifying. That's the suspension of habeas corpus, enemy combatants, whatever. The major defect in the Patriot Act, it had some sensible things, was authorizing the FBI unilaterally to obtain all of your business records, library records, whatever, without any judicial supervision. They just issue what they call administrative subpoenas. Initially, the act was so bad, if you got an administrative subpoena, it became illegal to even talk to an attorney that you had a problem with it and wanted to challenge it in court. You know, can you imagine that, drafting a law, making it illegal to consult about your legal rights? And you couldn't even identify yourselves when you went into court to challenge the constitutionality. Ultimately, the courts threw this out, and Congress had to change it. It's a case that stemmed from a library in Connecticut challenging the constitutionality of this particular provision. But that's the main issue here is this administrative subpoena authority, because it's used every day, will be extended. But the larger issue isn't just that. I say it's the other things like the amendments to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which basically authorize the government to intercept all of your emails and conversations without warrant, saying, since this is how the statute reads, and this is one, by the way, that Obama voted in favor of. It says that if the government can't establish that you're not in the United States, and I think I'm not a technological genius, I think if you're using email, you can't readily identify where you're sending the email from. It's not like a phone number. Then if they have some belief that you're outside the United States, then they don't need any warrant to spy on you. They can intercept your conversations and do whatever they want with it. They don't have to have any suspicion that you're engaged in any wrongdoing or any crime whatsoever. And they authorize what would in the old times be called a general warrant or a writ of assistance that enables the government to ask for a blanket authority to intercept conversations going between any 2 points, no matter who the callers are. And that Obama voted in favor of it, and he's not asking for its repeal. That's far more dangerous than the Patriot Act. But I understand your question really was this whole complex of authorities that are all, which can be repealed at any time. I mean, remember, there's nothing that says to Congress, once they pass the law, you can't even think about repealing it until the sunset comes. No, you can walk and chew gum at the same time, and you can repeal it earlier, I can guarantee you there's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress has to wait for the idiocy to have its full shelf life before it makes up to its senses. But I don't see there's no impetus in Congress to change any of this. And to me, what's most alarming is, why isn't Obama, some of these things Obama did oppose, the Military Commissions Act, why isn't he asking for it to be repealed? Or do you need those powers? Why do you're saying that you repudiated Bush, then how come you're claiming and using all the powers he had? Other than deciding he'd call people in Guantanamo by a different name. Rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So I don't, and also what is equally alarming is the American people aren't clamoring, say, get rid of this stuff. We want a new leaf here. We want a new chapter in the United States. Don't make us frightened. Don't inflate all the danger here. We all condemn 9/11. These are abominations, but they're bad things that happen in the United States all the time. We don't encourage them. We're as prudent as we can, but we know the only way you can have a risk-free life is to destroy all liberty. If you want to eliminate any conceivable evil that human beings can commit, just destroy the human race, right? Hey, this is great. We've now got it. No evil anymore in the world because we're all dead. And we understand the absurdity of that. Yet this is the mentality that goes, okay, do anything to try to minimize risk. No, we do things that are prudent to minimize risk, but no. We know we can't as human beings, given our flawed ability to understand human nature, identify every conceivable risk. We don't want to try.
Bruce, would you mind touching on the economic aspects of all the empire spending, especially combined with all the stimulus bailout plans, and especially the effect on young people in the long run on this thing?
Yeah. The costs of our empire are truly staggering. Afghanistan, Iraq, putting aside the 135 other military bases, we're talking about $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And what have we gotten? I mean, if we're trying, even Bernie Madoff's investments look good compared to that. We get Afghanistan, where it's a crime for a woman to say, I don't want to have sex with her husband. And that's what we get for $1 trillion. In Iraq, what's there? Sectarian killings and whatever. So that's a staggering, that's dead weight. It gets us nothing. And we also have now, with the bailout, equal trillions that's all being borrowed. I guess the budget deficits over the next years are estimated to fall somewhere between $9 trillion and $7 trillion. Who's gonna pay for this? It's typical that politicians will want to foist all the burden on somebody else. Hey, we'll let our successors bear the burden, which is all of the youth here today and your children. Somebody's gonna have to pay for that debt. It can't be foisted off indefinitely. And that by itself, I think, demonstrates how dangerously close we are to be getting on a permanent trajectory of empire that's going to lead to the destruction of the United States every bit as much as Rome was sacked in 410 AD by Alaric the Great. And that is the refusal to be inspired by the fact that the reason why we have our freedoms and liberties is because there were those hundreds of years ago that risked that last full measure of devotion because they cared about liberty coming after them. Those are the people at Valley Forge, Cemetery Ridge, writing the Constitution, being serious. And they wrote and they said, you read those Founding Fathers' papers. And they say, we must succeed. We must sacrifice so that we make sure that freedom lives. It's not discredited and we don't end up being a monarch. And they did sacrifice. They didn't watch video games or whatever, American Idol and this kind of triviality. And James Madison, he took every single book ever written on confederations before he went to the Constitutional Convention and read them. So he would be a master of how you could architect the Constitution to preserve freedom and liberty. They made sacrifice. And we need to appreciate that and make sacrifices ourselves so that our children and posterity will inherit freedom as well, not $8 trillion debts and an empire and a concentration of power in the executive that reduces the Congress and the people to inkblots. Because if we don't, no one else will. We're already very far down the road. If you read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of Rome, it takes 123 chapters to get through his 1,500-page tome. What we're at about chapter 99. We've got 24 chapters to go. It's time to turn it around. You know, oftentimes history is very flukish and things happen that you don't expect. But only if we stand up and call the bluff. We are living in a delusion. Inflated fears, belief that, well, we'll be here forever because we're strong. Reminds me of the British. They were ecstatic, celebrating the high point of the British Empire, Queen Victoria's Silver Jubilee. We will never, Britain forever will be the empire, you know. And within 20 years, they were crumbled. They were nothing because of the overreach and that attitude as well that they had of arrogance, insufferable arrogance. And so that's what these bailout, these expenditures mean. Okay, it's not up to us to protect those yet to be born. Those yet to be born, they don't make political contributions. They don't vote. Who cares about it? Eat, drink, and be married tomorrow. We'll die. Let somebody else pick up after us. And in fact, this is one, if you want to understand one of the elements of history that in my judgment is tragic, is those who are guilty of the greatest sins leading to the crumbling of a republic aren't going to be around when it finally collapses. When you look at those who suffered at the sacking of Rome in 410, the real culprits lived centuries earlier, who set in train the attitudes and the psychology that led to the crumbling of the Roman Republic and to the rise of the empire, and then everyone saying, it's too much of a bother to guard the borders, we'll let the barbarians do it, until the barbarians knew they could march two ways, to and from Rome. And that is what we need to change. We need to have people, their citizens viewed, it's up to us. We cannot respect ourselves if we give our children something to inherit that we wouldn't appreciate. And no one appreciates inheriting a $9 trillion debt in huge, huge deficits for the foreseeable future, and spending $1 trillion, not to protect our own liberties, but to protect Afghanis or Iraqis or whoever, under this idea that we're omniscient, we're omnipotent. We should push everybody around because we're an empire. Now, one of the sort of the ironies of the current situation is these particular characteristics of the United States were accelerated by the demise of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. That was what made us more arrogant, because then there was nothing out there to check us. That, in some way, was the beginning of the end. We remember right after the collapse of the Berlin, Fukuyama wrote, "The end of history. Democracy and freedom is won everywhere. We don't have to worry about anything. We have reached nirvana." Utter and complete nonsense, but everyone is inclined to think this is great. No, sometimes you're safer having less physical power, if you have the psychology that's right, than you are by having more guns. And that's where we are today. We don't recognize, no, more weapons, more military projection, more spending isn't necessarily safer. It can be riskier if you create enemies and you destroy the own internal checks and balances that give legitimacy to your government. Because ultimately, the government is strong as the people. If we had a true defense like I described, and everybody was here defending only the United States, we don't need a standing army. We'd treasure our freedom, and we'd fight spontaneously if everyone attacked us. And you do not need people necessarily trained in the highest level of use of weapons to win. That's what the independence of Israel should teach us. They didn't have standing army. They defeated 100 million Arabs. And we can do that as well, and we need to be confident. We don't need military everywhere. We'll fight, and we'll be proud of defending our country because it's our country we're defending, not some cave thousands of miles away.
Hi, I know you touched on this earlier. A couple other people had questions similar to it, but and I know you already talked about Gitmo with Obama, but his platform was pretty strong. Down with Gitmo, we're going to get out of Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Do you see any indication that anything remotely like that will happen on the horizon, and not just like the repeal of the Patriot Act, stuff like that, but bringing people home at all?
No. The answer is none. There are no earmarks indicating that any of those promises will be, to borrow from Shakespeare, honored in the breach rather than the observance. If anything, he's increasing troops in Afghanistan. Even when all the NATO partners say, well, we don't understand what you're doing. We'll train the police there. As though the problem in Afghanistan right now is the tribalists don't know how to shoot straight. They're not trained in weaponry, even though it's a Kalashnikov culture. That's the problem. We need to train them to use force, which is absurd on its face. No, if we're going to train them, we have to train them and give them loyalty to the government because it's worth defending, which is beyond our capacity. But no, there is no, and now what Obama says that we're eliminating our military presence in Iraq, except he's going to leave 50,000 troops in there. But like in Gitmo, he's going to say they're non-combat troops. They're going to confront danger and have to have weapons, but we'll call them non-combat. Now, 50,000 troops, that's more than all the troops we have in Japan with our defense treaty. It's more than all the troops we have in South Korea. This is removing our troops. And I would wager that he's not going to even get close to $50,000. As the political dynamics in Iraq tears it to shreds as we start to remove, the military people say, we can't leave now. There'll be a civil war. All of our 4,000 and more and 30,000 who were injured will have died in vain. We have to stay there. And Barack Obama will say, change circumstances, we'll have the troops there. And he's always hedged with regards to his withdrawal. But, of course, change circumstances. He says, I'll listen to my military advisors. And remember, he's going to listen to his military advisors. It's like having the chickens listening to the fox telling them how they should be safe. The military, and you can understand, they do not want to have to tell their troops, you died for nothing. It was, look, Iraq is as bad now as it was, or close to that with Saddam. Internal warfare, strife, the kinds of laws that we now see in Afghanistan. By the way, Iraq has something else comparable in their constitution that we celebrated. It's Article 7 says, no law can be passed that's contrary to the universal tenets of Islam. I was over there once and debating this particular issue. I said, all right, let's see, if Salman Rushdie wants to sell satanic verses in Baghdad, what happens to him? Because you have a provision in the Constitution that says freedom of speech is absolute. They said, well, we kill him. So, well, how's that freedom of speech? I said, well, freedom of speech doesn't include that, suggest that the Quran isn't infallible. That's the country that we're protecting now in Iraq. But I'm telling you that the military people will say we have to stay because they don't want to have all their troops have died in vain. They want to say, hey, we can't leave now because it's so politically unstable. And they know, Iran already is trying to make certain that any reduction of U.S. forces will mean they will become more prominent, and they clearly have no intent or a desire or interest in seeing Iraq stable and being a rival to them. After all, they fought a war with Iraq for 8 years, from 1980 to 88. So I think all of that is a big optical illusion. And that's why I say, and to some degree, it's the Obama administration, because I think he's the high watermark of our ability to get someone with cerebral capacity in the White House these days. That his continuation of this same attitude and mindset shows how deeply entrenched the psychology of empire is. He was popular enough right after he got elected, he could pull every one of those troops home and said, yeah, listen, Al-Qaeda are terrible people. Remember how Israel went after the perpetrators of the Munich Olympic massacres of Israeli athletes? They didn't declare war, but they got them. It doesn't mean, when you not have war in Afghanistan, it doesn't mean you don't have other ways to try to go after and serve that those who are criminals are captured or otherwise killed, but you don't need to have war with all that encroachments on liberties and theories of authority. And in my judgment, Obama's continuation of the war, but using more flowery and eloquent language, shows that we are in very, very great danger at present to losing our entire republic forever. The last thing, if I can just make a closing observation, because you are the future of the country. Now, I'm way past my meridian, so I'm going to be phasing out soon. But it's critical, and this is, I'm 62 years old, so I've been through a lot, all impeachments, everything bad that's happened in the United States, plus good. My most thrilling experience in my entire life was seeing Richard Nixon leave on a helicopter and say, no, I don't care whether you think the most powerful man in the world, the rule of law and the Constitution is more important. And just in thinking of what your own personal destiny should be, I'm telling you, you have in some sense the thrill of trying to turn this trajectory around. And that will be more fulfilling in all your life than going to Wall Street and doing hedge funds and going singing songs or whatever, because this really does count. This does count, because it's going to affect your children as well. You will feel each day you get up, you'll say, hey, this is important. My life is important. It's worth being. It isn't triviality here and just doing the optics. And that's why I'm so encouraged you came out, and to the extent that you can raise your level, you can do it. It's happened in the past. The greatest movements in history have began with a handful of people, whether it was the anti-slavery movement or women's suffrage movement or the beginning of the movement to end Jim Crow in the United States. You're never guaranteed success, but I can guarantee it'll be the most rewarding experience of your life. Thanks.